Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a truly bizarre aspect of history, one you probably never thought about. What toilet habits were really like in medieval castles. Picture this. You're standing in the grand hall of a majestic stone castle, wearing your finest attire, perhaps even holding court. You're surrounded by nobles and guests, chatting, eating, laughing. It's all regal, right? But suddenly nature calls. Where do you go? Well, let's just say it's not the luxurious bathroom experience you might be imagining. You probably won't survive this without a bit of a shock to your system. You're probably thinking, wait, they had castles. They had all these grandiose things, but they didn't have proper bathrooms. Well, that's exactly the point. The castles we romanticize today, full of lavish feasts and elegant tapestries, were also places of unpleasant realities. When it came to personal hygiene, you wouldn't expect to find porcelain toilets or running water. Instead, medieval castles were more like a medieval version of survival mode when it came to bathroom habits. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop me a comment too. Where are you watching from? And what time is it in your corner of the world? I'd love to hear from you. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In medieval times, castles were built for strength and defense, not for comfort. Think of them as fortified homes designed to withstand sieges, with thick walls, narrow windows, and a single entrance. But those castle walls, they didn't exactly lend themselves to modern plumbing. Instead of indoor restrooms, the inhabitants had to get creative with their bathroom solutions. If you were a noble living in one of these castles, your toilet situation was a bit ... less than royal. The term privy might come to mind, and yes, it's about as pleasant as it sounds. The word privy referred to small, often hidden areas built into the structure of the castle where people could relieve themselves. And while we associate the term with the privilege of having a toilet for medieval people, a privy wasn't a luxurious private experience. More often than not, it was just a hole in the wall sometimes, literally. Let that sink in for a second. Imagine needing to go. There's no private bathroom door to shut, no fluffy towels, no soft lighting. Instead, you're crouching down over a cold open hole, perhaps out in the cold windy courtyard. And as if that wasn't enough, most castles didn't have any form of indoor plumbing. So those privies weren't exactly built with comfort in mind. In fact, some castles even had guts, a term used for the pipes or tunnels that ran below the building, where human waste was dumped. But we'll get to that. While it's easy to laugh at how different life was back then, the lack of toilets in castles raises a few questions. First, why didn't castles have proper bathrooms? And second, how did people manage their toilet business in a place that was supposed to be the height of wealth and power? As you probably guessed, things weren't always as regal as they seemed. When it comes to understanding why medieval castles didn't have indoor plumbing, we need to take a little history detour. Castles were built during a time when sanitation wasn't exactly high on the priority list. The Romans, for instance, had sophisticated baths and public latrines, but once the Roman Empire fell, the knowledge of advanced plumbing systems mostly vanished from Europe. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and plumbing was pretty much non-existent, at least in the grand castles. At first glance, this seems baffling. You'd think that if anyone could have had fancy bathrooms, it'd be the aristocrats who ruled from their grand castles, right? But castles were designed for function, not comfort. Their main purpose was defense, not luxury. The thick stone walls, the narrow windows, and the heavy drawbridges were all there to keep invaders out, not to make life cozy for those inside. It was until the early modern period that indoor plumbing began to make its way back into the picture. But by then, castles were losing their purpose as fortresses. So instead of toilets with flushable systems, medieval people had to get creative. Enter the privy. The word itself is derived from the Latin privatus, meaning private, which ironically didn't exactly make the whole toilet experience all that private. Picture this. A medieval privy wasn't exactly a fully functional room you could shut the door on. Sometimes, the privy was just a small, uncomfortable hole in the wall, often in a corner of the castle. For the most part, it wasn't even enclosed. If you had to go, well, you did your business and prayed that no one would catch you in the act. Historians still argue whether these privies were actually sanitary. Most didn't have any sort of drainage or plumbing systems, so waste often just accumulated under the building, leading to unsanitary conditions. Others, however, believe that the gut system helped carry waste away from the main living areas. This was not always effective. In a castle, the privy was often perched up high, with a hole in the floor where waste dropped straight down. There is something oddly fascinating about this. So imagine living your life under the threat of invaders and constant war. And your biggest concern becomes not how you'll defend your castle, but where you'll relieve yourself. So who handled all of this? Not the lords or ladies. While they may have had the privilege of using the privy, they certainly weren't the ones dealing with its aftermath. That responsibility fell to the castle servants, the poor souls who worked tirelessly to keep the place running. The idea of having someone clean up after your waste was not unique to modern times. In fact, in medieval castles, it was a regular part of life. But let's take a moment and talk about the practicality of medieval toilets. For example, many castles didn't even have a proper bathroom space. The privy wasn't a place of comfort or cleanliness, but rather an awkward necessity, usually located somewhere in a remote part of the castle. While the more privileged may have had a slightly better setup, such as a designated room with a bench-like seat, it still lacked any form of plumbing. And if you were lower in the social hierarchy, you likely had to make do with a chamber pot or simply find a secluded corner. Historians still debate whether any castles had truly modern systems, with a flush of water running to move waste away. There's evidence that a few castles had primitive drainage systems. But even these were far from what we would consider advanced. The truth is, medieval people had far less concern about hygiene than we do today. There was no soap and running water to wash your hands after your business, so sanitation was an afterthought at best. Even when castles did have privies, they were rarely used by the common people who lived in the surrounding villages. Instead, commoners would have used a simple chamber pot container that could be carried around for quick use. And once they had finished, it was their responsibility to empty the chamber pot, often out a window or down a nearby drain. So you can imagine that life around castles wasn't just about the drama of politics and defense. It was about dealing with an overwhelming amount of waste, both inside and outside the walls. These chamber pots became a source of fascination, especially since they served multiple purposes. Not only did they store waste, but they were sometimes used as makeshift toilets during feasts or events, making them an essential part of castle life. If you were a noble and had a chamber pot, you likely didn't have to wander too far for your needs. But the servants? They had the unenviable job of collecting, emptying, and cleaning these containers. And this was all done while the aristocracy feasted and partied inside the castle walls. To put it bluntly, medieval castle toilets were a far cry from what we now consider luxury. In fact, it wasn't until the Renaissance that we began to see improvements in sanitary facilities in Europe. But for now, you can imagine that medieval life, especially in castles, came with a lot of unpleasant odors. And those chamber pots, though incredibly useful, likely weren't the most pleasant of things to handle. Now that you've got a sense of just how uncomfortable medieval castle toilets could be, let us take a closer look at the people who were responsible for dealing with all that waste. Spoiler alert, it wasn't the rich lords and ladies who had to worry about it. Instead, the task of handling toilet duty fell squarely on the shoulders of the castle servants. The unsung heroes of medieval sanitation. Picture this. You're a servant in a grand castle. Your responsibilities might include everything from cleaning the lord's chambers to making sure there's always fresh food on the table. But when it came to toilets, the task of maintaining them, cleaning up waste, and ensuring that privies didn't overflow was all part of the job. And let's not forget, the servants didn't have the luxury of modern cleaning supplies. The tools they had to use were basic scrubbers made of sticks, rags, and whatever else they could find. If you were one of these servants, you'd probably be waking up in the early morning hours to tend to the privies. You'd have to go from room to room collecting chamber pots, many of which had been used during the night by nobles who preferred to not leave their beds to relieve themselves. The poor servant would then take these chamber pots and empty them sometimes out a window, sometimes into a nearby ditch or drain. You've got to imagine, it was not a job for the faint of heart. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, you'd have to scrub and clean the chamber pots before starting it all over again the next day. It's hard to think of a worse job than cleaning waste with no modern equipment, right? Historians still argue whether this task of cleaning the chamber pots was ever delegated to lower status servants, or whether it was done by someone within the household staff who had to endure this privileged misery. Regardless, castle servants had to be prepared for the unsavory aspects of castle life. Everything from serving meals to dealing with the messiness of human waste. And despite the gross nature of their work, these servants were often far more essential to the functioning of the castle than we give them credit for. The lords and ladies could live in the splendor of their homes, but it was the servants who kept everything running smoothly, privies and all. And let us not forget the night watchmen, those brave souls who stood guard at the castle gates and walls, keeping watch over the land and ensuring that the castle wasn't attacked. You might be surprised to learn that some night watchmen also had to take care of the toilets too. Since these night guards were already on the lookout for any signs of trouble, they were sometimes tasked with the unfortunate job of handling waste disposal. Of course, this meant that even though they were armed with weapons for protection, their duty still involved dealing with messes of a very different kind. Can you imagine the irony? Standing guard against invaders one moment and then dumping chamber pots the next. Not exactly the glamorous, heroic life we might imagine. But there is a twist to this story. While the lords and ladies didn't have to worry about the messier side of castle life, they weren't exactly free of discomfort either. In fact, the very design of the castle meant that waste was often close to where they lived. That's right, the poor servants weren't the only ones who had to deal with smells and messes. In fact, the nobility often had to endure unpleasant odors as well, especially if their privies were in poor condition. In some cases, these privies were located just outside the main castle building. Depending on the wind, the stench could easily drift into the rooms where the wealthy resided. Historians still debate whether the nobles were fully aware of the messiness of their castles. Did they try to ignore it, or did they simply accept it as part of life? We'll never know for sure, but considering the efforts the aristocracy went to in order to maintain their other luxuries, it seems unlikely they were totally indifferent to the smells wafting through their windows. Now, let's talk about the chamber pots again. These were the modern solution to having a toilet right next to your bed. During the night, when a noble or even a servant had to relieve themselves, the chamber pot was the go-to item. But here's the kicker. People didn't just use them for emergencies. Chamber pots were used in every room of the castle, so yes, that meant the fancy dining halls, the sleeping quarters, and even places like the drawing rooms had a chamber pot stashed away for quick access. The chamber pot wasn't just a tool of necessity, it was a symbol of medieval life. It was a constant reminder that, even in the grandest of castles, things weren't always as pristine as they seemed. And once the chamber pot was used, it was up to the servants to collect and empty it. As you can imagine, the task of disposing of the contents wasn't a pleasant one. Most servants would pour the waste into a large communal waste bin, which would then be taken out of the castle to be disposed of in a nearby ditch or drain. But remember, these castles were often built on a hillside, so waste might be tossed down a slope or even directly into the castle moat. That's right, the moat that was supposed to protect the castle from invaders might have been a waterlogged waste dump as well. Historians still argue whether this was an efficient method of waste disposal or just a recipe for disaster. Either way, it didn't exactly make the castle smell like roses. Alright, now that you're imagining the less than glamorous realities of medieval sanitation, let's take a deeper dive into the evolution of the privy, a word that's almost synonymous with medieval castle toilets. But here's the thing. The privy wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was an invention. An early attempt at providing some sort of semi-private restroom for the castle's occupants. It may have been far from the luxury toilets we enjoy today, but it was a step forward in its time. In castles, the privy often wasn't just a basic hole in the wall or an open-air latrine. Some were built inside the castle's thick stone walls, while others were perched over the side of the building, so the waste would fall directly into the moat, or in some cases, down into a nearby pit. These privies often had small wooden seats with a hole in the middle, often placed near the top floors of the castle to help waste fall more easily to the ground. The problem with these early toilets was that they didn't really do anything to contain the smell. The waste just hung there, accumulating underneath the castle, and the stench would often rise up into the castle's living spaces. Imagine being in a grand hall, enjoying a feast, and then suddenly catching a whiff of, well, less than pleasant odors wafting through the room. It wasn't exactly the luxurious experience you'd expect from the so-called elite. But here's the kicker. These privies were a step ahead of what common folk had. While nobles had their thrones, peasants didn't have any formal toilets at all. Instead, they used field latrines, or simply relieved themselves wherever they could find a quiet corner of the village or town. Even in the towns outside the castle walls, sanitation was primitive at best. In fact, townspeople didn't even have proper waste disposal systems. They used public latrines, some of which were shared by multiple people at once. Talk about communal. Historians still debate the social class implications of these privies. Some suggest that the privy, with its somewhat private nature, was an early form of social status, marking the difference between the nobility and the common folk. While peasants were left to fend for themselves, Nobles could at least take comfort in knowing that they had something resembling privacy. But the truth is, even with their better seating arrangements, the privy was still incredibly unsanitary. As the centuries went on, some castles began to develop more sophisticated waste systems. For example, some castles had drainage systems that helped funnel waste away from the living quarters. But even with advancements in waste management, castles still struggled with maintaining cleanliness. A lot of the time, waste just piled up, and the sanitation situation was grim, especially in the more remote parts of the castle. But things didn't always improve. In fact, some castles were so unsanitary that they became breeding grounds for disease. The buildup of human waste, combined with poor ventilation and little attention to hygiene, made these castles petri dishes for illness. In addition to the spread of disease, the smell in these castles was sometimes unbearable. Guests in the halls might have thought they were entering a grand castle of luxury, but they were met with the same smell as a run-down public restroom. Historians still argue about whether these waste systems were ever effective at all. Some believe that even with drainage systems, the castles still suffered from poor hygiene, while others argue that the systems at least helped contain the mess. Either way, the reality was that medieval people were living with the consequences of these primitive toilets for centuries. But there's another surprising factor to consider: the waste itself. What exactly happened to all the waste that was disposed of in castles and surrounding areas? Well, not everything went straight into the moat or a pit. Some waste was actually used for other purposes. Yes, you heard that right. In a bizarre twist, human waste in medieval times was sometimes used as fertilizer. Farmers, especially those in the rural areas surrounding castles, often collected human waste to spread over their fields. It was considered an effective, if gross, way to enrich the soil. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was. Some sources claim that the use of human waste as fertilizer was fairly common, especially in poorer areas where resources were limited. But the practice wasn't universally accepted. Many nobles likely saw it as distasteful, especially if the waste was from their own castle. Still, it's a strange irony that the waste of the wealthy sometimes helped grow the crops that sustained those living on the fringes of society. Now, let's take a moment to think about the smell of medieval toilets and waste disposal systems. As you can probably guess, medieval people didn't have the luxury of air fresheners, cleaning products, or even the simple concept of hygiene that we take for granted today. Castles, which were often dark and damp, had a tendency to trap odors, especially in areas where waste was collected. Even worse, the waste didn't always just fall into the ground, or the motit would sometimes get stuck in the drains, leading to even worse smells. Historians still argue whether people of the medieval era were simply accustomed to the smell, or if they were used to it to even notice. It's easy to imagine that over time, the stench of human waste became part of daily life. Maybe it was just another background element in the noisy, bustling world of medieval life. So next time you step into a clean, modern bathroom, think about how far we've come from those medieval days when a simple trip to the toilet was an ordeal in itself. By now, you might be wondering just how medieval people kept themselves clean if their toilet options were so primitive. Well, the good news is that they did have some methods of hygiene, though they were far from the standards we take for granted today. Let's start with the chamber pot, the real MVP of medieval bathroom technology, if you were lucky enough to have one. It meant you didn't have to wander through the castle's many corridors in search of the nearest privy. Instead, You could go in the privacy of your own room, close the door, and do your business. Chamber pots were essentially small, portable toilets that you could keep beside your bed. But remember, this wasn't the luxury experience we're used to today. These pots were made of ceramic or metal and were not exactly designed for comfort. Once used, the chamber pots had to be emptied. This meant that the servants who were tasked with the dreaded job of emptying them had to collect the contents and dispose of them in the appropriate manner. And that usually meant tossing it out a window. Yes, you read that right. The waste often went straight into the courtyard, the street below, or in some cases, directly into the castle moat. Imagine walking through a beautiful, historic castle and seeing someone casually toss their chamber pot's contents out the window, all while the waste splashes below. Not exactly the picture of medieval glamour. But chamber pots weren't the only way medieval people tried to stay clean. Bathing, you ask? Well, not as often as we'd hope medieval hygiene was. Well, let's say a little less advanced than what we're used to now. While it's true that people bathed, the frequency and method were vastly different. For the most part, medieval people didn't take daily showers or even regular baths like we do today. Instead, baths were much more of a rarity, with nobles bathing more frequently than commoners. And in fact, bathing was often seen as a luxury rather than a necessity. When people did bathe, they usually did it in large tubs of water that were heated over a fire. The nobles, with their spacious chambers and well-served staff, would have their servants fill the bath for them. But you couldn't just pop in a bathtub and turn on the water like we can today. No, medieval baths required serious preparation. The water had to be carried in buckets from the well or river, and it was often heated in large cauldrons over the fire. Once the water was warm enough, you'd settle into the tub, which may or may not have had a nice scented soap to go with it. But don't think for a second that everyone had access to such luxury. For the average peasant, bathing was far less common. Some would have used rivers or streams to bathe, though this wasn't always possible in winter. Others might have resorted to wiping themselves down with a damp cloth or rubbing their skin with oils and herbs. People didn't have access to fancy toiletries like we do today, so hygiene often came down to basic tools, like rags, water, and occasionally scented oils. Interestingly, medieval people didn't have the same obsession with body odor that we do now. In fact, the idea of smelling good wasn't a high priority. What mattered more was that you didn't smell too bad. People would use herbs, oils, and scented waters to mask the natural smells of the body. But these were far from the advanced deodorants and perfumes we use today. Some nobles would even wear fragrances made from flowers, herbs, and oils to try to keep the body's natural odors at bay. But for the most part, people lived with the reality that their hygiene was far from perfect. Historians still debate whether people in medieval times were truly unaware of their lack of hygiene, or if they simply accepted it as a fact of life. Some argue that people in the Middle Ages didn't mind the smell, because it was all they knew, while others believe that there was a level of awareness, but it simply wasn't considered as important as other matters like food, shelter, and survival. Either way, it's clear that medieval sanitation wasn't about comfort or cleanliness. It was about getting by. Now back to those chamber pots for a moment. As much as we might laugh or cringe at the idea of using such a simple device, the chamber pot was an essential part of life in castles. Without it, the lords and ladies of the castle would have had a much tougher time living their daily lives. In fact, chamber pots weren't just for night use, they were also used during the day. If you had to go and there was no privy nearby, you'd relieve yourself in your chamber pot, and then a servant would take care of the rest. This system was incredibly inefficient, but it was the best solution available at the time. You might also be wondering about the health implications of living in a castle with such unsanitary conditions. Well, there's no easy answer. While medieval people were generally resilient in terms of disease, the lack of hygiene did contribute to the spread of illness. In fact, many medieval castles were breeding grounds for diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. The accumulation of human waste, combined with poor ventilation and overcrowded living spaces, made castles unsanitary places to live, even if the exterior looked pristine. In fact, many castles were equipped with latrines or waste disposal systems that drained into the moat. But as you can imagine, this didn't always work as intended. Waste would often sit for days or weeks before being properly disposed of. And the stagnant water in the moat would create a perfect breeding ground for bacteria and diseases. So while castles were impressive structures, they certainly had their downsides when it came to health and cleanliness. Historians still argue whether the poor sanitation in castles was a significant factor in the spread of disease, or whether it was just one of many contributing factors. What we do know for sure is that medieval people didn't live in the kind of hygienic environment we have today. Their methods for managing waste, cleaning themselves, and dealing with odors were crude by today's standards. But for them, it was the best they could do.
So, now that we've covered some of the grim realities of medieval castle sanitation, let's take a moment to appreciate the lack of plumbing in these massive fortresses. We're so used to modern conveniences, flush toilets, hot showers, and clean water flowing directly into our homes, that it's hard to imagine a time when all of these things didn't exist. Castles, despite their size and grandeur, were virtually plumbing-free zones, which meant that people living in them had to find creative solutions to manage water and waste. As you can probably guess, the absence of plumbing meant that everything had to be hauled in. Water was brought into the castle from nearby wells, streams, or even rivers. The castle's inhabitants would rely on servants to carry water in buckets, to fill up barrels, basins, and the like. For cooking, cleaning, and bathing, all of it had to be carried manually, often in large quantities. Imagine being one of the lowly servants who had to bring in bucket after bucket of water, sometimes in freezing temperatures, just to make sure the nobles had enough water for the day. It wasn't just backbreaking work, it was essential for the survival of the castle's occupants. To make matters worse, water was often dirty. While some castles had access to fresh sources of water, the reality was that many relied on wells, which could become contaminated. In fact, during sieges, it was common for castles to have their wells poisoned by invaders, leaving the people trapped inside without a clean source of water. So, the nobles who lived in the castle were often just as vulnerable to the lack of hygiene as the peasants outside. The dirty water would be used for everything from drinking to washing to even cooking, and there was little to be done to ensure its cleanliness. Some castles, of course, had more elaborate systems, such as cisterns that collected rainwater, but even these weren't always reliable. Let's not forget about the dreaded waste disposal. You know by now that medieval castles didn't have flush toilets, and even the privies that existed didn't work particularly well. But here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Imagine living in a castle where human waste was literally sitting beneath your feet. In some castles, the waste would pile up beneath the floors and the walls of the building, creating a smelly and unsanitary environment. It's hard to imagine how anyone could stand to live like that. But that's exactly what people did. For them, this was just a part of everyday life, something they had to deal with to get by. Historians still debate the efficiency of these early waste systems. Some argue that the lack of plumbing and sanitation was simply an oversight by the castle designers, while others believe that people didn't care about hygiene as much as we think. Could the medieval nobility have had more advanced systems in place? Maybe. But it's clear that sanitation was a low priority in the grand scheme of things. Survival, defense, and power were the main goals of these massive stone fortresses, not cleanliness. The state of the toilets and waste systems reflects this harsh reality. But not everything was completely unhygienic. Some castles did have designated washing rooms or bathing areas, though these were far from the luxurious spas we think of today. These rooms were often little more than small, damp chambers with a simple tub where you could bathe with water that had to be carried in. In some castles, the royalty might have had a more elaborate setup, perhaps with a tiled or stone floor, but these bathing rooms were still a far cry from the clean, private bathrooms we have today. The idea of indoor plumbing didn't exist for medieval Europeans, but it wasn't unheard of in other parts of the world. In places like the Islamic Empire, there were complex sewer systems and sophisticated bathrooms. But in Europe, it was a different story. The Romans, of course, had some of the most advanced plumbing and bath systems of their time. But after the fall of the Roman Empire, that knowledge was largely lost in Western Europe. And while the idea of having a modern bathroom seems like such a simple luxury to us, it wasn't until the late Renaissance that more advanced plumbing systems started to take hold, and even then, only the wealthiest had access to such systems. In fact, it wasn't until the 18th century, well after the medieval period, that modern plumbing became widespread in Europe. So, while medieval castles may have been luxurious in terms of their architectural splendor and design, they fell short when it came to something as basic as sanitation. It was a system built for defense, not for comfort, which left the residents with few options for personal hygiene. Historians still argue whether castles could have been designed better with more thought given to cleanliness and sanitation. It's easy for us to judge, sitting in our modern homes, with hot running water and flush toilets just steps away. But back in the day, people simply didn't have the same standards of hygiene we've grown accustomed to today. It's worth noting, though, that even though their toilets were primitive by modern standards, the people who lived in castles were often innovative in their attempts to solve the problem. From elaborate privies perched on high walls to primitive waste tunnels, these early systems were far from perfect, but they were an attempt to deal with a very real issue. So next time you use a modern toilet, think about the creativity that went into the earliest efforts at sanitation. In the grand scheme of things, medieval toilets and plumbing systems were a reflection of the era's priorities. Survival, security, and power. Cleanliness came much later, if it came at all, but still, as unglamorous as it was, the privy and chamber pots served a crucial role in the medieval castle. It may not have been comfortable or sanitary, but it worked for the time, and sometimes that's all you can ask for. Now, we've already talked about the basic and rather primitive nature of castle toilets. But what about the public toilets outside the castle walls? Castles may have had their own unsanitary waste disposal systems, but towns and villages surrounding the castles weren't exactly equipped with state-of-the-art facilities either. In fact, if you were a commoner, your toilet options were probably even worse than those of the nobles in the castle. Most medieval towns didn't have any form of proper sewage or waste management systems. Instead, people had to rely on communal toilets which were often little more than a hole in the ground, sometimes shared by dozens of people. These public latrines were often located on the edge of the town, near a river or stream, where waste could be discarded more easily. But as you might imagine, these public toilets were far from private or clean. They were often unsanitary, with little or no means of cleaning up after yourself. To make matters worse, many of these toilets were built over a pit, meaning that all the wastes would just collect underneath the sea. And as you can imagine, that pit would overflow if not properly emptied, which could lead to unpleasant and dangerous conditions. Even worse, human waste was sometimes dumped directly into the streets, especially in smaller towns and villages where there weren't any designated latrines. You can imagine the chaos that this caused. Filth everywhere, puddles of waste on the roads, and constant exposure to harmful bacteria and disease. The stench was probably unbearable. People living in these towns had to deal with the stench on a daily basis. For the common folk, sanitation was far from a luxury. It was an ongoing battle just to maintain some semblance of cleanliness in their environment. Historians still debate how the medieval working class coped with the lack of hygiene and waste management. Some sources suggest that public latrines were often very crowded and people were forced to wait in line to use them. There's evidence that some towns even fined people for using the street as a toilet, which suggests that people were fully aware of how unsanitary the situation was. Yet, despite the clear risks, there wasn't much that could be done until modern plumbing systems came into place centuries later.
In fact, some towns actually regulated waste disposal, encouraging people to use public latrines or directing waste to certain areas of town. It was a sort of social norm to relieve yourself in these communal spaces. But the reality was that public toilets were often beyond unsanitary, and it wasn't unusual for people to become ill from exposure to waste. You might be thinking, surely the nobility didn't have to deal with these disgusting public toilets, right? Well, not exactly. While the rich had the luxury of their own privies and chamber pots, they didn't exactly escape the unsanitary conditions of the towns. In fact, the noble class could often be found in the public latrines as well, though they would likely have had privileged access. It wasn't uncommon for wealthy families to own private latrines, or they may have had special servants to attend to their waste management needs. But even with their special treatment, they were still exposed to the same risks of disease that everyone else faced. After all, medieval towns had little to no sanitation infrastructure, so even the wealthiest of people were vulnerable to illness. It's also worth noting that toilets in medieval towns were often located in places where people gathered near markets, public squares, and places of business. So, while the rich might have had their own private spaces, they still had to deal with the fact that their towns were essentially breeding grounds for disease and filth. And that's a far cry from the pristine public restrooms we take for granted today. Historians still argue whether the lack of sanitation in medieval towns was a significant factor in the spread of disease. But one thing is clear: the medieval mindset wasn't concerned with hygiene the way we are today. Hygiene was considered a luxury, something that wasn't available to the common folk. Instead, people focused on more pressing concerns, like food, shelter, and surviving harsh winters. As a result, medieval towns were often filled with waste, and public toilets only served to add to the mess. But here's an interesting point. Despite the unpleasant conditions, medieval towns and castles were still teeming with life. They were bustling centers of commerce, trade, and culture. And even though the waste disposal systems were rudimentary at best, people managed to live and thrive in these conditions. Maybe it's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Or maybe it's just proof that people adapted to their environment, no matter how dirty it was. Of course, we're not suggesting that people enjoyed these conditions. Medieval people, especially the poor, had to find ways to survive in these unsanitary environments. They probably spent most of their time just trying to make sure they had enough to eat. And dealing with the messy realities of waste management probably seemed like just another obstacle to tackle in their daily lives. Looking back, it's easy to see just how far we've come. Modern plumbing has transformed the way we live, allowing us to enjoy sanitary, hygienic environments at home and in public spaces. But for medieval people, the lack of plumbing wasn't just a matter of inconvenience, it was a matter of survival. And while the castles and towns of the time might seem romantic in retrospect, the reality of living in those conditions was far from glamorous. Historians still debate whether things could have been better, whether innovations in plumbing could have made medieval life more comfortable and sanitary. But in the end, the people of that time did what they had to do to survive dealing with poor sanitation, bad smells, and all the other discomforts of medieval life. So, next time you flush a toilet or wash your hands with warm water, take a moment to thank the innovations that have made our modern lives so much more comfortable than those of our medieval ancestors. Alright, now that we've seen the sheer discomfort and ingenuity behind the medieval waste systems, let's take a closer look at the role of animals in managing the messes that built up in these castles and towns. You might think that medieval people were stuck with their own waste problems, but surprisingly, they didn't tackle it alone. Animals, specifically pigs, played an unexpected role in the medieval waste disposal process. You might find this bizarre, but let's dive into how these animals helped clean up the mess. In many medieval towns, pigs were a crucial part of the sanitation system, not as workers with little aprons, but as natural waste managers. These pigs were often allowed to roam the streets and alleys where they would scavenge for food. And guess what? They didn't discriminate. They'd eat anything they could find, including the waste that people left behind. This may sound gross, and it definitely wasn't the cleanest solution, but it was effective in its own way. The pigs would clean up scraps and even human waste, reducing the amount of filth lying around in the streets. But the use of pigs in waste management wasn't just a one-off. In fact, towns often kept pigs precisely because they served this dirty but necessary function. Imagine a world where the streets are constantly filled with waste and you don't have the luxury of modern trash collection. The pigs were a simple solution to an ongoing problem, something that medieval people probably didn't think twice about, but which would make us cringe today. Historians still debate whether pigs were the primary waste disposal method or just part of a larger system of cleanup. Some argue that pigs were allowed to roam the streets as a means of keeping waste manageable, while others believe that they were part of a broader ecosystem of waste reduction that also involved human effort. In either case, it's clear that the pigs played an important role in keeping things somewhat under control in towns with limited sanitation options. Now let's talk about another animal that helped in this bizarre situation: dogs. While dogs weren't generally used to clean up waste in the same way as pigs, they still had a crucial role in helping medieval people manage filth and waste. Dogs were often kept to guard the waste bins and latrines, protecting the precious food scraps that people couldn't afford to waste. And let's be honest, they likely helped with waste control in other ways too, chasing after rats and other vermin that could spread disease through the garbage and waste piles. Interestingly, historians still aren't entirely clear on just how much dogs and pigs contributed to the cleanliness of medieval towns. The evidence isn't consistent, and the lack of detailed records makes it hard to pinpoint how animals were used in waste disposal. Some sources suggest that it was common practice to let pigs roam the streets in larger towns, while others say that it was a more sporadic occurrence. Regardless, the presence of animals in managing waste was undoubtedly a key part of medieval life, even if it wasn't exactly sanitary by our modern standards. And speaking of waste, let's revisit the moats surrounding castles. While many people think of moats as simply a water barrier meant to keep invaders out, the truth is that they sometimes doubled as garbage disposal systems.
Yes, you heard that right.
The waste and garbage from the castle were often dumped directly into the moat. This meant that the water could get pretty gross. In fact, there are records of castles with stagnant, smelly moats, where waste accumulated over time, making the moat more of a health hazard than a defensive feature. Historians still debate whether moats served as water storage for washing or drinking water, or if they were just purely used as a convenient place to get rid of waste. Some scholars argue that it was only the lower-class citizens who contributed to the moat's filth, while others suggest that the entire castle community, from the nobility down to the servants, used the moat for waste disposal. One thing's for sure: the moats weren't exactly the pristine, picturesque water features we think of today. In many cases, they were a necessary evil, helping to keep the castle a little bit cleaner in the absence of better waste management solutions. Interestingly, the stagnation of water in moats led to another problem: mosquitoes. The dirty, stagnant water in the moats was the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes, which brought with them diseases like malaria and dysentery. These diseases would often ravage castle populations, especially during the summer months when the mosquitoes were most active. While the castles were designed to be fortresses, they were far from disease-proof. And with the filthy water in the moat, along with the lack of proper hygiene inside the castle walls, it's no wonder that medieval people were at constant risk of contracting deadly diseases. Historians still argue about the overall health risks of living in castles during the medieval period. Some believe that the lack of sanitation led to widespread sickness, while others argue that the outbreaks of disease were primarily due to external factors like poor weather and the movements of armies. What's clear, though, is that the state of sanitation, whether in the form of waste in the moat or disease spread by vermin, made life in a medieval castle uncomfortable and dangerous at best. Now, let's take a quick pause and acknowledge that despite all the unsanitary conditions, medieval people were still able to survive, build grand castles, and leave a lasting legacy. Yes, they had major sanitation issues, but they managed to adapt to their environment in ways that helped them keep going. It's a strange combination of resilience and ingenuity that allowed people to survive and thrive in an era with little regard for hygiene. As we close out this section, think about the difference between our world and the medieval one. We have flush toilets, sanitized water, and a wealth of information on cleanliness. They had pigs, moats, and chamber pots. But despite the difference in our conveniences, both eras share a common thread. People found ways to deal with what life threw at them. It might not have been pretty, but it worked well. Mostly. As we've explored, sanitation during medieval times was far from glamorous, but it also wasn't without its peculiarities. Now, let's shift gears and dive into the hygiene myths of medieval people. These myths and misconceptions paint an image of a time that, for all its filth and discomfort, was oddly more advanced in certain ways than we give it credit for. One of the most pervasive myths about the Middle Ages is that people didn't bathe. You've probably heard this one. People in medieval times were so dirty they never bathed, and they stank all the time. While it's true that daily bathing wasn't a regular practice for everyone, this belief is far from the complete truth. The idea that medieval people never bathed is a gross oversimplification. fact, bathing did exist, but it wasn't as frequent as it is today. Nobles, in particular, had access to private baths. These were often wooden tubs, and the water had to be heated manually over an open fire. The wealthy in medieval society would have servants fill these baths with hot water and provide them with oils and herbs to help clean their skin. However, bathing was considered a luxury, so it wasn't something that was done often. For the most part, people were content with wiping themselves down with rags or using scented oils to mask body odor. The concept of personal hygiene was tied less to frequent washing and more to covering up unpleasant smells. For common folk, bathing was less of a priority, but it did still happen. In many rural areas, people would bathe in rivers, lakes, or streams. And though the water might not have been as clean as what we're used to today, it was still an attempt to stay somewhat fresh. Of course, bathing was usually reserved for special occasions, and for most of the year, people relied on scented oils and herbs to keep body odor at bay. Some also used herbal soaps, made from plants like lavender and rosemary, which were believed to have cleansing properties. Historians still argue whether these occasional baths were effective in maintaining cleanliness. Some believe that, while bathing helped remove dirt and sweat, it didn't necessarily prevent illnesses like we think of today. Others claim that bathing combined with other hygiene practices helped medieval people maintain a basic level of cleanliness, even if it wasn't ideal. Ultimately, the frequency of bathing didn't matter so much as keeping odors under control. In this sense, medieval hygiene was more about perception than actual cleanliness. Now let's talk about another hygiene myth that's often attached to the medieval era. The idea that medieval people didn't brush their teeth. If you've ever seen those medieval depictions of people with gnarly, rotting teeth, you might assume that dental hygiene was non-existent. But like many things in medieval life, the reality is a bit more complex. People in the medieval period didn't have toothpaste like we do today, but they did try to clean their teeth. It wasn't unheard of for people to use herbs, twigs, and even ash to scrub their teeth. One common method was using chew sticks, which were twigs from trees that had been known to have antiseptic properties. People would chew on the ends of these sticks until they became soft, and then they'd use them to scrub their teeth. Some people also used baking soda to clean their teeth. Though this was more common in the later years of the medieval period. Interestingly, the issue of dental health in the medieval period was, in just about cleanliness. It was also about diet. Most people ate a diet rich in bread, grains, and vegetables, which meant they were constantly eating foods that were difficult to chew and that could cause tooth decay. The sugary treats we're familiar with today weren't as common, but fruits and honey were still consumed in large quantities. This, combined with the lack of proper dental care, meant that tooth problems were prevalent. And many people in the medieval period had decayed teeth by the time they reached adulthood. Historians still argue about how widespread the use of these tooth cleaning methods was. Some believe that these methods were used more often in the wealthy classes, while others suggest that even common folk used herbs or chewing sticks to clean their teeth. It's likely that the use of such methods was somewhat sporadic, depending on factors like class, region, and access to materials. But one thing's for sure, people didn't just ignore their teeth in the medieval period, even if they didn't have the dental care we rely on today. Speaking of food, let us turn our attention to the diets of medieval people and how they impacted their bathroom habits. The diet of the average medieval person wasn't exactly balanced by modern standards. Most people ate a lot of bread, porridge, and stew along with seasonal vegetables. Meat was reserved for the wealthy, though peasants could sometimes get their hands on small amounts of poultry or pork. In fact, the poor often relied on grains for sustenance, and their diet was likely high in fiber. This high fiber diet had a significant impact on their bowel movements, and it's one of the reasons why medieval people were more regular when it came to bathroom habits. They didn't have modern toilet paper, of course, but they did have natural materials to wipe themselves, depending on where you were. Straw, moss, and rags might be used for cleaning. In castles, it was common to use wooden sticks or cloth to clean up after using the privy. But here's the interesting part. Because medieval people didn't consume processed foods, they likely had fewer digestive problems than we do today. The high-fiber diet helped with regularity, meaning fewer problems with constipation or irregular bowel movements. While modern diets often lead to digestive issues, medieval people likely had fewer digestive complaints because of the natural foods they ate. And despite their lack of modern plumbing, this made going to the bathroom in a medieval privy somewhat more routine, if not entirely pleasant. Historians still debate whether medieval diets were actually healthier than ours in some ways. Some argue that the high-fiber diet was the key to their overall health, while others point out that the lack of variety in food and the absence of proper nutrition led to a number of health problems. Either way, the connection between food and bathroom habits was something that medieval people were well aware of, even if they didn't have the medical knowledge we have today. And by now, UVA probably realized that the medieval world was not exactly sanitized or hygienic by modern standards. But that docent mean people didn't try to manage their waste and personal cleanliness in ways that worked within the limitations they had. The smell of medieval castles, towns, and cities was an ever-present part of daily life. And while it may have been unpleasant, it was something that people simply accepted. But what about the royalty? Did the wealthy have any better luck when it came to cleanliness and comfort? The truth is, even the most elite members of society were still living in difficult conditions. When it came to sanitation, while the rich may have had access to private privies, they were still living in environments where waste disposal was rudimentary at best. The castles, although grand in appearance, often had unpleasant smells emanating from beneath the floors, in the courtyards, or in the moats. It was just the commoners who had to contend with waste nobles often had to endure it too. In fact, one of the most striking aspects of medieval castles is the contrast between their grand exterior and the sometimes filthy interior. The nobility might have had the luxury of comfortable, well-furnished chambers, but they still lived in close proximity to waste. The privy would often be located just a few feet away from the living quarters. The lack of plumbing meant that the human waste had to be dealt with in the most basic ways. And even the wealthiest people had to rely on a servant to clean the chamber pots or tend to the privies. Now let's talk about the use of public latrines in medieval towns. While castles might have had some form of private waste disposal, the people living outside those castle walls had even fewer options. Public latrines in medieval towns were crowded, dirty, and unsanitary. Picture this: a communal toilet shared by dozens of people, located in a busy street or market square. These latrines were often nothing more than a simple hole in the ground, usually covered with a wooden seat. And while some towns had latrines, others simply had public dumps, which were nothing more than pits where people would go to relieve themselves. These public toilets weren't just unsanitary, they were dangerous. They often overflowed, spilling human waste into the streets. And with no proper waste disposal systems, the streets of medieval towns became breeding grounds for disease. In fact, Many historians believe that poor sanitation contributed significantly to the spread of plague and other diseases. Non-contagious rats and fleas, dirty water, and waste were major players in the spread of illness, especially in towns with no modern sewage systems. Historians still argue about whether the lack of sanitation infrastructure was a key factor in the spread of disease during medieval times. Some believe that the lack of cleanliness and proper waste management helped diseases like the Black Death spread so quickly, while others suggest that factors like overcrowding and poor nutrition were more to blame. Regardless of the cause, there's no denying that medieval hygiene was a major issue for both the rich and poor alike. At this point, you might be wondering, how did medieval people deal with the smell? If the air was constantly filled with the odor of waste, how did they cope? The answer lies in their perception of cleanliness. Medieval people didn't have the same obsession with cleanliness that we do today. While they understood that dirt and filth could lead to disease, they didn't have the knowledge or resources to do much about it. Their attitude toward hygiene was more about masking the smell and living with it, rather than eliminating it entirely. The use of scented oils, perfumes, and even flower petals became a popular way to hide the odors of the day. Nobles might have used these to mask the stench of waste in their chambers, but for most people, the smell was simply something they endured. Historians still debate whether people were aware of the health risks posed by poor sanitation. Some believe that medieval people understood that waste and filth were linked to disease, but they had little idea how to prevent it. Others argue that, for the most part, people lived in denial about the role of hygiene in health. After all, in a world where disease was rampant and medical knowledge was limited, people might have just accepted illness as a part of life. In fact, many medieval people didn't believe in the germ theory of disease, which meant that they had no idea how infections spread. Instead, they believed in concepts like humors and bad air. And their focus was more on balancing the humors in the body than on maintaining proper hygiene. It wasn't until the Renaissance and later centuries that the importance of sanitation and cleanliness became more widely recognized. In the 1700s, some European cities began to implement sewer systems and public health regulations, which marked a huge improvement in sanitation and hygiene. But for the medieval period, people just had to deal with what they had donned. That often meant living with the stench, the filth, and the discomfort. Looking back, it's easy to judge the medieval era as dirty and unsanitary. But it's important to remember that people of the time didn't have the knowledge or technology we take for granted today. They did what they could with the resources available to them, and in some ways, they were more resilient than we give them credit for. Despite the poor sanitation systems, the medieval world carried on, and eventually, the lessons learned from those primitive systems would lead to the development of the sophisticated sanitation systems we have today. So, next time you sit comfortably on a modern toilet, take a moment to appreciate the advancements that have made our world so much more sanitary than the one medieval people had to endure. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel a little better about your own bathroom experience. As we continue to explore the uncomfortable and unsanitary realities of medieval sanitation, it's time to talk about the smell of the castles themselves. You've probably already guessed that medieval castles were far from fresh. In fact, they were downright stinky at times. It's hard to imagine how the nobles and servants of the time endured the pungent odors of their homes. But they did. So, why exactly did castles smell so bad? There were a number of contributing factors. For one, there were no modern waste systems to manage human waste effectively. As we've already seen, Waste was either disposed of in a nearby moat or simply dumped into a pit beneath the castle. This led to stagnant waste accumulating in the grounds around and beneath the castle. Castles were usually built in damp environments with poor ventilation, which allowed odors to fester and linger. Now imagine that. You've spent all day in a grand hall feasting and socializing, and as the evening draws in, the strong smell of human waste, animals, and unwashed bodies begins to invade your senses. The smell was likely most noticeable in the lower parts of the castle where the privies were located or where waste accumulated. This didn't just affect the servants, it also impacted the nobility, whose private chambers were sometimes built directly above the waste pits. In fact, one of the biggest complaints medieval people had about their castles was the lack of fresh air and poor ventilation. While castles had large, impressive halls and open courtyards, many of the smaller enclosed rooms were dank and musty. These areas didn't have windows, and what windows there were didn't open. The smell of damp stone, combined with the lingering waste odors, made these rooms unpleasant to live in. Historians still debate the extent of the odors in castles. Some believe that people living in castles simply got used to it. After all, they didn't have the same clean, fresh air we enjoy today, and to them, the smells of waste, food, and animals were just a part of daily life. Others suggest that the stink was so overpowering that it might have made certain rooms nearly uninhabitable unless absolutely necessary. Either way, it's clear that life in a castle, for all its grandeur and splendor, was not the clean, fragrant existence we often imagine. And speaking of animals, let's talk about their contribution to the medieval castle odor problem. Castles weren't just inhabited by people, they were also full of animals. The noble families often kept horses, dogs, and other animals within the castle walls. And these animals were essential for defense, transportation, and hunting. However, they also added to the stink. The stables where the horses were kept, for example, were often in the basement or at the lower levels of the castle. While the horses may have been valuable for the nobility, their waste was not quite as desirable. Stables, which were poorly ventilated, quickly filled with the scent of urine, dung, and the general odor of wet hay. Even the noblemen had to live with these smells in their daily lives. And let's not forget about the dogs. They may have been adorable companions, but they weren't exactly housebroken in the way we expect today. Historians still argue about how the nobility tolerated the smells of the castle. Some say that nobles were more tolerant of odors because they were used to them from their constant exposure to the outside world. Others argue that servants and other lower-class castle dwellers were more affected by the smells than the aristocracy. In fact, some even believe that the higher classes had specific rooms designed to block out odors from the rest of the castle. This idea was supported by some records that show wealthier families in castles often had their own private chambers and bathrooms, away from the main living spaces, to avoid exposure to unpleasant smells. But even with all the animals and waste piling up, it wasn't just the stench that made castles difficult places to live in. The lack of cleanliness extended to the people living there as well. Remember, without modern cleaning supplies, castles were breeding grounds for dirt, grime, and bacteria. Floors, which were often made of stone or dirt, couldn't easily be swept or mopped. So dust, food scraps, and other debris accumulated over time, making the castle not just a place of unpleasant smells, but also a haven for germs. Historians still argue whether these conditions contributed significantly to the spread of disease. While many people didn't understand how diseases spread in the way we do today, it's likely that the buildup of dirt, waste, and lack of proper hygiene played a role in the spread of diseases like plague and cholera. Some historians suggest that the Black Death and other epidemics were worsened by the unsanitary conditions found in both the castles and towns of medieval Europe. But it wasn't all bad. Some castles did have some innovative solutions to the smell problem, especially the larger, more well-off ones. For instance, some castles were designed with special chimneys that could carry smoke and hopefully some of the bad smells out of the building. These chimneys, however, were often small and didn't work as well as the modern ones we have today. Still, they represented an attempt to improve the ventilation and reduce the buildup of odors. Overall, though, the real solution was just living with the smells. Medieval people didn't. Do you have the luxury of stepping into a clean bathroom after every meal, or enjoying the pleasant scents of modern air fresheners? They made do with what they had, trying to mask the odors as best they could with herbs, oils, and perfumes. And while the nobles might have had more luxury in terms of private rooms and better accommodations, even they had to live in a world where stale air waste smells, and the constant presence of animals were simply part of life. Historians still debate whether medieval people were fully aware of the hygiene issues that plagued their homes and cities. But it's likely that most people just accepted it as normal. While some wealthier people might have had better living conditions, most people, including those in castles, lived in a world where cleanliness wasn't a top priority. Hygiene was an afterthought in the grand scheme of life, where defense, survival, and wealth were the central concerns. But even with all the unclean conditions, there's something remarkable about the resilience of medieval people. They managed to survive in conditions we might find unbearable today, proving that humans can adapt and persevere no matter how uncomfortable the situation. As we continue to explore the unsanitary reality of medieval life, it's time to take a step back and consider the broader cultural attitudes towards cleanliness and hygiene. How did medieval people view cleanliness, and what did it mean to be clean during this era? In contrast to modern times, where cleanliness is a hallmark of good health and social status, in the medieval world, hygiene was often regarded as a luxury or afterthought, with personal cleanliness being less of a concern than survival, war, or politics. In fact, cleanliness in medieval Europe wasn't always equated with good health. The concept of hygiene was closely tied to spirituality, especially in religious communities. Many people believed that bathing too often could be dangerous to the soul, as it was seen as a self-indulgent act. Religious scholars argued that excessive bathing was a sign of vanity and pride, and therefore some medieval communities actively discouraged bathing. Monks, for instance, would often have a practice of minimal bathing, as it was seen as a spiritual discipline to endure dirt and discomfort. This cultural attitude was a result of deeply ingrained medieval beliefs in the spiritual significance of bodily purity, rather than the physical cleanliness we now prioritize. It wasn't unusual for medieval people to forego bathing for weeks or months at a time, and those who did bathe were often limited to using public bathhouses that were frequently shared by entire communities. These communal baths were, unfortunately, not the sanitary spas we think of today. They were often crowded and poorly maintained, with the water getting dirty quickly due to the large number of people who used them. While we may look back on this period and think of it as unsanitary, it's important to remember that medieval people had a completely different framework for understanding cleanliness. To them, bathing was indeed as essential as it is to us. It was more about avoiding sin and spiritual purity. This is also why many people in medieval Europe often preferred to cover up their natural scents with perfumes and scents, which were used to mask any unpleasant body odor. Some even believed that bathing could be harmful, as it might expose the body to evil spirits or harmful vapors. So, while we might be disgusted by the idea of not bathing regularly for medieval people, it was more about surviving the harsh conditions of their environment and maintaining their spiritual well-being. After all, in a time when plagues, wars, and famine were constant threats, personal hygiene didn't always take priority over basic survival. On top of this, public bathhouses were often the only place where many people could get a bath. These bathhouses were places where people came together to wash, socialize, and relax, and they served as hubs of activity in medieval towns and cities. But while they served a social function, bathhouses also had a notorious reputation for spreading disease, especially during times when plague was rampant. Some historians even believe that bathhouses contributed to the spread of the Black Death, as the unsanitary conditions in these public spaces allowed disease to spread rapidly among the population. One of the interesting aspects of the medieval bathhouse was that it was also a place for business transactions. For some, a visit to the bathhouse wasn't just about getting clean, it was a social and economic affair. Nobles, merchants, and townspeople could strike deals, socialize, and even engage in illicit activities while soaking in the communal bath. But even with all the social benefits, these bathhouses were often breeding grounds for disease, especially since the water wasn't always clean, and the facilities were shared by large numbers of people. Despite the presence of these communal spaces, the lack of private bathrooms or modern plumbing meant that people had little control over their personal hygiene. Unlike today, where we can easily wash our hands and bodies whenever we choose, medieval people had limited options. They often had to rely on improvised methods, like cloths, herbs, and rivers, to clean themselves. For people in villages and rural areas, these primitive methods were often their only recourse. Historians still argue whether public bathhouses or personal hygiene were a significant factor in the spread of disease during medieval times. Some suggest that the overcrowded, poorly maintained bathhouses were to blame for outbreaks like the Black Death, while others argue that the true cause of disease was the lack of sanitation in both the cities and rural areas. However, it's undeniable that the bathhouse served an important role in medieval life, both as a social hub and a necessary evil in a time when disease was rampant. On the flip side, the upper classes had access to private baths. These were typically used only by the wealthier members of society, who had the means to afford the luxury of a personal bath. These private baths were often wooden tubs filled with water carried from nearby wells or rivers, and were more of a luxury than a necessity. But even the wealthy nobility didn't bathe as frequently as we might expect. Their use of water was often limited to special occasions, and some may have only bathed once or twice a year. Believing that overbathing could be harmful to their health. In fact, wealthy medieval people were not necessarily more hygienic than the lower classes. While they may have had better access to water and baths, the nobility still lived in close proximity to waste and often dealt with similar hygiene issues. It was not unusual for castles to have stagnant wastes or overflowing privies, which contributed to the spread of disease. However, it's worth noting that wealth did provide some protection the aristocracy might have been able to avoid. Some of the more squalid conditions of medieval life but they still had to endure the stench and unsanitary conditions that were rampant across medieval society. Historians still argue about the role of wealth in medieval hygiene. Some suggest that the wealthy had access to more sanitary conditions, while others claim that wealth had little impact on cleanliness, as even the nobility had to contend with poor waste management systems and the lack of proper plumbing. But one thing is for sure, even the wealthiest people in the medieval period couldn't escape the unpleasant realities of life before modern hygiene. Let us now shift our focus from the personal hygiene practices and waste management systems to another fascinating aspect of medieval sanitation: the role of food and diet in the bathroom habits of the time. You might be surprised to learn that the medieval diet played a significant role in shaping the bowel movements of the period and subsequently. The state of the privies and waste systems. Understanding what people ate and how their food impacted their digestive health can shed some light on why medieval sanitation was such a challenge. First, let's talk about the staple foods of the medieval period. For the majority of the population, especially the peasants, the diet was based heavily on grains, primarily bread and porridge. The bread was made from coarse flour, often with a mix of barley, rye, and other grains, as wheat was mostly reserved for the wealthier classes. This diet was rich in fiber, which meant that medieval people were typically much more regular when it came to bowel movements compared to modern populations. The high fiber content helped to keep things moving, and in many ways, the medieval diet promoted better digestive health than many modern diets that are low in fiber and high in processed foods. The downside of this high fiber diet, however, was that it often led to flatulence, bloating, and unpleasant digestive noises. So, you can imagine that meals in medieval castles or towns were not always as refined as they might seem. Even the nobility, who enjoyed more varied diets than peasants, often had to deal with the after effects of their fiber-heavy meals. These digestive issues likely added to the unpleasant atmosphere of the castles, where poor ventilation, waste accumulation, and a lack of modern plumbing only made matters worse. Historians still argue whether the fiber-rich diet contributed to better health in medieval times, or whether it was more of a necessary evil. Some suggest that the natural diet provided by the land helped medieval people maintain good health, despite the lack of modern medical care and sanitation. Others point out that while the fiber helped digestion, it didn't make up for the poor hygiene and unsanitary conditions that exposed people to a variety of diseases. But it wasn't just bread and porridge that shaped people's digestive habits. The meat-heavy diet of the nobility also had a significant impact on waste management. Wealthier medieval people ate a lot of meat, particularly beef, pork, and venison, as well as wildfowl like duck and swan. In addition to meat, they consumed large amounts of cheese, eggs, and other animal products, which contributed to a higher fat diet. This meant that, while they had more calories to fuel their bodies, they also had more waste to dispose of, and that meant the privies had to be cleaned out more frequently. But for all the food that came into the body, the medieval people had no way of easily disposing of the waste. For the rich, this meant that the servants were often tasked with cleaning out chamber pots or maintaining the privies, while for the poor, it meant a constant struggle to keep their living spaces as sanitary as possible. But no matter how much effort was put into cleaning, it was nearly impossible to maintain cleanliness when waste was being continually produced and stored in such primitive systems. Now, while meat and grain were the primary sources of nutrition, let's talk about a surprising contributor to medieval waste disposal: beer. Yes, Beer. It's well known that medieval people drank a lot of beer. And a Lynn fact. Beer was a significant part of the medieval diet for both the rich and poor. But what does beer have to do with bathroom habits? Well, considering the limited access to clean water, beer and ale were often consumed instead of water because they were safer to drink due to the fermentation process. While this kept people hydrated, it also meant that beer became a primary source of liquid intake, containing more waste to dispose of. Historians still argue about the impact of alcohol consumption on the health of medieval people. On the one hand, beer was a useful alternative to contaminated water and provided essential calories. On the other hand, consuming so much beer often, unfiltered and high in alcohol, could have led to a range of digestive issues. One of the outcomes of this high beer consumption was the likely increase in the frequency of bathroom visits, since the body would need to dispose of all that liquid. This again contributed to the need for frequent cleaning of the privies and chamber pots. The important takeaway here is that medieval diets were much more directly tied to the state of sanitation and waste management than we might realize. The foods people ate, the beverages they consumed, and the way they digested all impacted the functioning of the medieval privy systems. What's fascinating is that while the food was rich in nutrients, the unsanitary conditions of the time still meant that people were at high risk for diseases, some of which were directly caused by poor waste disposal and contaminated food and water. In some ways, the medieval diet, high in fiber, low in refined sugars, might have kept people healthier, but it didn't solve the fundamental problems of sanitation. Without the proper waste disposal systems, all the good nutrition in the world couldn't protect people from the spread of disease. And the lack of modern waste management made it incredibly difficult to keep public spaces clean. So while medieval people didn't have the luxury of modern conveniences like indoor plumbing, their daily routines and eating habits were deeply intertwined with the complex reality of managing waste. Historians still debate whether medieval people could have prevented the spread of disease by improving their waste systems. Some argue that with better food storage, cleaner water, and more effective sanitation practices, the medieval world could have significantly reduced the prevalence of illness. Others believe that even with those improvements, medieval people would still have faced life-threatening risks due to the lack of a clear understanding of germs and disease transmission. Either way, it's clear that food and waste were inextricably linked in the medieval world, and managing both was a daily challenge. By this point, we've covered a lot of ground about medieval sanitation and the unusual methods used to handle waste. But let us take a step back and consider something that might have seemed downright miraculous. The early attempts at improving sanitation in the late medieval period. While most castles and towns relied on primitive waste management systems, some began to experiment with more sophisticated solutions to the problems they faced. These efforts, while rudimentary by modern standards, marked a significant step forward in the evolution of sanitation. The medieval world, particularly in the later years of the period, started to see the early development of waste management systems that would eventually evolve into modern sewage systems. One of the most notable innovations during this time was the creation of drainage systems that helped direct waste away from living spaces and into more controlled areas like rivers or nearby pits. These early systems, though basic, were a step in the right direction, as they prevented waste from stagnating and festering in the heart of the town or castle. Many of these early drainage systems were built in larger cities and wealthy castles. In some cases, these systems were fairly sophisticated for the time, with channels or tunnels running beneath the city or a castle to carry waste to designated areas. In fact, some castles even had running water piped in from nearby sources, though this was still a rarity. These early efforts at plumbing were more about convenience than hygiene. They were meant to ease the lives of the wealthy and reduce the burden on servants who had 2 empty chamber pots or clean privies. While these drainage systems were still a far cry from what we have today, they marked an important shift in medieval thinking. For the first time, people were beginning to realize that waste management was not just a matter of survival, but also a matter of health. As medieval society started to understand more about the spread of disease, towns began to invest in systems to control waste more effectively. Historians still debate whether these early drainage systems had any significant impact on public health at the time. Some argue that they were more symbolic than functional, providing a sense of cleanliness without actually improving the situation on the ground. Others believe that these systems were a precursor to the advanced plumbing and sewage systems that would come later, laying the groundwork for modern sanitation. But while these efforts were certainly innovative, they were still a far cry from modern plumbing systems. In most cases, waste was still being disposed of in rudimentary ways by being dumped into nearby rivers, pits, or moats. The infrastructure was limited, and the methods were primitive. It wasn't until the Renaissance and early modern period that plumbing systems became more widespread, particularly in cities like Paris and London, which saw the construction of sewer systems that would eventually form the backbone of modern waste management. Interestingly, the Enlightenment period played a role in the growing awareness of sanitation and public health. During this time, people began to realize the link between poor sanitation and the spread of disease, and modern hygiene practices began to emerge. The development of the sewer system in London in the 19th century, for instance, was a direct result of this growing awareness, and it paved the way for the creation of more efficient and effective waste management systems around the world. But even before these later developments, medieval towns and castles were taking tentative steps toward cleanliness and hygiene, whether through better drainage systems, more careful waste disposal, or the occasional use of herbs and oils to mask unpleasant odors. People were attempting to manage their waste in ways that improved their quality of life. It may not have been pretty, but it was progress. The privy, as basic as it was another example of this early sanitation effort. Over time, some castles and towns developed specialized privies that were more than just holes in the ground. These were sometimes constructed over pits or channels, allowing waste to be carried away more efficiently. The introduction of these more sophisticated privies, though still crude by modern standards, was a sign that medieval society was starting to recognize the importance of keeping waste away from living spaces, especially in castles and more densely populated towns. Historians still debate the extent to which these early sanitation systems improved public health. Many scholars argue that, while these systems were certainly steps in the right direction, they were not enough to address the broader public health issues of the time, without a true understanding of germs and disease. Transmission, even the best drainage systems, were still insufficient in preventing outbreaks of plague, cholera, and other diseases that spread rapidly due to poor sanitation. But what's clear is that these early efforts at sanitation were foundational for the future. The systems put in place during the medieval period may not have been perfect, but they represented the first attempts to deal with the growing problems of waste and cleanliness in a more organized and systematic way. For the people of the time, these early systems likely seemed like huge advancements. Imagine a medieval noble, finally able to use a privy that didn't simply dump waste on the ground, or a town that developed rudimentary sewers to carry waste away from the streets. Though these innovations were nowhere near what we would expect from modern sanitation, they made life a little easier and cleaner for people living in these otherwise filthy environments. As we look back at the medieval era, we can see how far we've come in terms of hygiene and sanitation. Modern toilets, plumbing, and waste management systems have revolutionized the way we live. But it's important to remember that these innovations didn't come overnight. They were built upon centuries of trial and error, beginning with basic systems like the privy and simple drainage ditches. Without these early efforts, we might not have the clean, comfortable environments we enjoy today. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through medieval sanitation, let us take a moment to reflect on how far humanity has come. 2. Appreciate the incredible advancements that have transformed our understanding of hygiene and waste management. The medieval period, though incredibly challenging in terms of cleanliness, laid the groundwork for what would eventually become modern plumbing, sanitation systems, and even public health. But as we look back on the medieval era, there's something to be said about the resilience of the people who lived in those conditions. The castles, the towns, and the villages of medieval Europe may have been dirty, smelly, and often unhealthy, but they were also places of incredible human ingenuity. Despite the lack of plumbing and sanitation infrastructure, people adapted to their environments. They found ways to live and survive with what they had, even if that meant using herbal concoctions, scented oils, basic waste disposal systems to keep themselves and their surroundings tolerable. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked for the time. But the medieval period was not just about survival, it was also about growth. As time passed, people began to recognize the need for better sanitation. From the simple drainage ditches of medieval towns to the evolution of waste systems in the Renaissance, sanitation slowly but surely became more of a priority. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, the need for modern sewage systems and clean water was undeniable. The insights and discoveries of the past were combined with new scientific knowledge, resulting in the systems that revolutionized public health. While the medieval people didn't know about germs or disease transmission, their experiences with plagues and illness led them to create systems that, albeit rudimentary, helped mitigate the spread of disease. And it's important to remember that, despite the inadequacies of medieval sanitation, these early systems represented humanity's first steps toward public hygiene and healthcare. In many ways, the privy symbolizes this historical journey. The transition from a hole in the wall to more sophisticated waste management systems was a slow and painful process. But as public health systems advanced and new methods of dealing with waste were developed, societies became healthier and people's understanding of hygiene evolved. The lessons learned in the medieval period paved the way for modern waste management, which is now crucial to our daily lives. Today, we can flush a toilet, access clean drinking water, and live in hygienic conditions that were once unimaginable to medieval people. And while modern sanitation systems are far from perfect, they represent an extraordinary leap forward from the unsanitary conditions of the past. As we reflect on this long journey through history, it's easy to be grateful for the modern amenities we take for granted. The clean water we drink, the flushing toilets we use, the soap and hot water we have access to all. These things are a direct result of centuries of innovation, hard work, and sometimes tragic missteps. But it's important to recognize that the evolution of sanitation is a testament to the ingenuity and determination of people throughout history. So as you go about your day, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come in terms of cleanliness and public health. The next time you step into a clean bathroom, think back to the smelly, uncomfortable conditions of medieval castles and towns, where waste management was a daily struggle. It wasn't a glamorous time, but it was a time of innovation, and that, ultimately, is what led to the modern world we live in today. With that in mind, let's slow the pace a bit, take a deep breath, and let this journey through medieval sanitation come to a peaceful close. While life in the medieval world may have been filled with discomfort, disease, and odors, it was also a time of growth and change, one that set the stage for the health and cleanliness we now enjoy. Now, dim the lights, breathe deeply, and let the peaceful serenity of the modern world wash over you. Imagine the clean air, the modern comforts, and the smooth flow of life in a world that's learned from the mistakes of the past. It's a long journey from the dirty streets of medieval towns to the sanitary systems we rely on today, but we've made it. So as you drift off to sleep, feel the comfort of knowing that no matter how grim things once were, we've come a long way. Sweet dreams, and may you wake up to a world that's much cleaner than the one our ancestors knew. Sweet dreams.